Forbes Books presents Leading What Matters Most, the podcast that helps you change behaviors, improve performance, and unlock the potential of your people. Here's Phil Geldart.
Hello, Kindra.
Hey, Phil. How's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you for being part of the podcast. Thank you for being all the stuff that you do. So it's great.
So thrilled to be able to sit down and chat with you today.
So what part of the world are you in?
I am in New York City. So I feel like I should warn you at any moment there could be a buzz with an errant delivery person. I have no deliveries ever come here, but you just never know. They get enthusiastic. How about you?
No problem. I'm just outside of Toronto.
Oh, great. Oh, I love that
Yes.
area.
Yeah, it's a great part of the world. So
Yeah.
So Kindra, thank you so much. Reading your stuff and looking at your videos have been fascinating. So I would love to hear a little bit about your story of your story.
Yeah.
But let me give you a little bit of context so you can kind of know which point, where to send the conversation.
Yeah.
We are an experiential learning company, which we'll chat about a little later. And one of the most popular courses we run worldwide is how to tell stories for executives. It's unbelievable, the powerful storytelling. But clearly we are not in your league. Clearly we don't have anywhere near the expertise that you do. But one of the things that we are seeing more and more is leaders want to acquire this ability. So I'd love to hear your thinking a little bit about, obviously, why stories are so important, the impact that they've had, but how you feel they can really help a leader in their organization to be more effective. And then we'll migrate into a couple other things. Would that be a good start?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start.
Okay, so over to you. What do you think?
Well, when it comes to storytelling, and it's exciting and also not surprising to hear that is your most popular course, a popular topic worldwide, the importance of storytelling and leadership. And that's, the ultimate bottom line is that humans, whether you're a leader or not, are born storytellers. This is part of our DNA. This is simply how we are biologically designed. And researchers have tested this. They've looked back through the millennia to see what really gave humans their ultimate edge over any other species. And they say even to skip entire evolutionary barriers was our ability to be able to tell stories to each other, to be able to talk about things that weren't sitting right there in front of us, to talk about ideas and missions and to motivate people and to bring people together, to know who to trust, to know who to build connections with. All of that was done because we were able to tell stories. So this has been there from the very beginning of time with our wisdom teeth, with our appendix. Like, this is the human's ultimate edge. So again, like I said, it's not surprising that when we tell stories, and the reason that so many leaders are now wanting to become better at this skill is because we know this is how we can get ahead.
So help me understand why it is that it's so difficult for people. I mean, it would seem to me that it would be something that's natural, but clearly it's not, because they need people like you to guide them into being more effective. But why is it difficult, or why would a leader, do you think, feel that, well, it's not natural, it's not something that comes easily to me?
I think, what's funny is I think it's our great edge, and it's also our ultimate demise. The fact that we can think in stories then leads us to seek out other stories that tell us that being able to tell stories must just be too easy. Like, it's too easy. Why? How can that be something that's so natural? How can that be the thing that makes us great? And I talk about this in the story Edge. Like, you don't see the scorpion second guessing its ability to poison its poison prey to have food. You don't see zebras questioning whether or not they're striped. They just use their stripes to camouflage themselves and to distract their predators. And so I think the fact that we are able to think in stories causes us to underestimate the power of stories because it just seems too easy. Now, you have to also remember this has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, thinking that it must be harder than it is. Go back to, the beginning of getting a business education. There wasn't any talk in there about the importance of being able to tell stories. We were teaching all of the other skills, all of the other approaches that we needed to harness and work on. But in the process, we got so far away from our ability to tell stories that we stopped doing it. Now, here's the thing. We stopped doing it in a business environment. Make no mistake, we still tell stories to our friends. We still tell stories to our children, to our partners, to each other. Like in a casual setting, in a non-professional setting, we're still telling stories. It's when we get to work that we start thinking, and we've been trained, that it requires other skills.
So one of the things that you commented on was that stories build trust. And I think leaders are constantly needing to build trust with their employees, certainly if they want to be good. So chat a little bit with us about why it is that stories are so effective at building trust and how they can be used to that end. Because somehow in my mind, storytelling humanizes the teller a little bit, and it gives me a common ground. It's sort of like a way to chat. But how do you, in your mind, feel that that is then going to help me as a leader build trust and perhaps connect more effectively with the group I'm working with?
Yeah. And this is an excellent question. So let's answer it on two different levels. First, let's go back to biology. Paul Zak, actually, who's a neuroscientist, studied at this to see, are there chemicals that are released in the brain when we hear a story? And one of the chemicals that he found that our brain releases as we're listening to stories is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is known as the trust hormone. This is how we build empathy. This is how we experience emotion. So just that rush of oxytocin alone is a natural building block for building trust between people. And keep in mind, this is an automatic response. This is something that, the person you're talking to we can't adjust that, how much oxytocin is released. That is just something that happens. So on a biological level, we have that working for us. And then in addition to what you said, Phil, the other way that stories help build trust is as we're listening to the story that a leader is telling us, not only are we hearing the story that they're telling, the words that we're saying, but because story is our natural language, we are also experiencing and reading into the things that they aren't saying, the expression of who this person really is, the essence, if it's a story about overcoming a challenge, we're not just hearing how they overcame the challenge, but we're experiencing, we're visualizing, we're feeling, oh, well, this is the kind of person who can look on the bright side. This is the kind of person who will look out for their team when we experience a challenge. There's a lot of listening between the lines when it comes to leaders telling stories. And I don't say that in a negative way. I say that when we're sharing our stories, we're expressing the essence of who we are. And expressing that essence builds trust much more quickly than just listing off your previous business accomplishments.
So you chat about stories falling into 4 categories, but just leave that for a moment.
Okay.
If I'm a leader and I want to use a story, help me understand sort of what I should be thinking. Like, does it have to be short? Does it have to be long? Does it have to relate to the topic? Am I using it to build rapport? Like, if I've never encountered the concept of storytelling as a leader,
Yep.
and I should be using them more effectively, what should I be thinking about? how can I use them to make me more effective when I really have no concept what we mean by story?
Yep. Let's talk about this. I want to give you, I call it, I don't have an official name. So let's try on the story triad. Okay. Maybe this will be the next book, Phil.
Next book. Okay.
So when you're a leader and you want to use a story, you believe now how compelling this will make you, all of the great things that it will do. And just like you said, you can build rapport, you can illustrate the value of your idea, you can build trust, all of these great things. Here's what I want you to think about. First, I want you to think about the message you are there to deliver. At the end of this story, what do you want your audience to think, feel, know, or do as a result of hearing this story? If maybe your story, the story that maybe you're in a meeting and sales are down and the team morale is struggling a little bit, and you want them to know that it isn't over till it's over. Okay, maybe you only have 2 weeks to reach this goal, whatever it is. So you need a story that at the end of it, you want your team to know that it isn't over till it's over. You want them to feel motivated to keep going until they're fully across the finish line. That's the message. That's the message you want to deliver. Okay, so hold that in your mind. The second point of our triad, let's call it, is I want you to think about the audience. Who are they? Like, and that could be on a variety of different levels. Are they all in sales? Then that's one thing to know about them. Are they all brand new? Are they all really experienced? What do they think about you? Maybe you're a new leader, and so you're threading an interesting needle there. Maybe you're an established leader and you've never encountered a barrier like this before. Who is the audience and what is your relationship to them? What's keeping them up at night? What are your barriers to getting through to this audience? All right. So once you have those two things, now it's time to find a story that is the third point of the triad that brings it all together. So if you're trying to tell a story that builds morale, you're thinking about your audience over here. They've already been working really hard. They're really tired. They've been pushing towards this goal. They're discouraged. Now and maybe they do trust you. Let's say that you've been through a lot of things. Now what you need to do is find a story that meets in the middle of those 2 points. So here's what I would recommend. You have a couple of options. You can, and I'll divide it into two. You can think about a story from your professional experience. When was a time that you've faced this struggle before? Maybe as a leader, or maybe when you were in their position, you were a member of a team and there was a big goal and you were pushing towards that goal and you were all exhausted. You could think about that in a professional sense. You can also tell a story from your personal experience. Maybe you played sports and you were up against the big guys, this was the final inning of the playoff or whatever it is, and you had to make the play in order to make it work. You could tell that story. Okay, so that's the first place to start. And we haven't even gotten into what it takes to tell a great story, but essential for leaders above anything is to remember that the story needs to illustrate your message. It needs to be relevant to your audience. Then if you have those two things covered, how long it is or how short it is, none of that matters as much, because if you've matched the message to your audience and you're telling a story, you're buying more time. Okay, they'll listen to the story if it's clear why you're telling it to them. And one other thing I would recommend is give yourself a couple of minutes to look into this, okay? And by a couple of minutes, I mean, if you know you have an important meeting coming up in 2 days, instead of just going over your notes and the data that you're going to share and the points that you're going to make, take some time thinking about what story you could tell, because ultimately, if you tell a story, that's the thing that they're going to remember.
Yeah, no question. Okay, amazing, fantastic. Let me repeat back what I think you said, because something has been in the back of my mind, which I think you just addressed. So in the back of my mind is, if you say to someone, tell a story, forgetting if you don't have your background for a moment, you think, oh, well, as a kid, I told stories, or as a parent, I tell stories to my children. So the concept of story carries with it the lack of power that it can have. Just our sort of socio background, the way in which we've been brought up. But what you just said was, if you think of that kind of the storyteller's triad, the issue is less about the story and more about the point you want to make. So when you said the example, this is going to be a really tough time and we're about to tackle it, let me tell you a story. It illustrates the point and raises the concept of story to a much more powerful level. So I think, if I understand correctly, your triad is very powerful because it says it's not about the story. It's about what you want to lead them with, and the story is the best way to get there. Now, to have the impact, it's got to be relevant to the audience. Don't tell helicopter pilots a story about sales.
Yeah.
And the story has got to have relevance that the person understands why you're telling it, from personal or professional. Did I get that right?
Yep, that's absolutely right. And really what we're getting at here is, certainly we tell stories to our friends, we tell stories to our kids. What we're talking about here as leaders in business is, now we're talking about strategic storytelling. Stories as the vehicle for better understanding, for deeper connections, for motivating action, and compelling communication.
Cool. So one of the things that we teach in the world of communication is, how do you use analogies or metaphors? Because they provide a bridge between what I am feeling and what I want you to feel.
Yep.
So instead of using words, I can use an analogy.
Yep.
So would you say a story works in a similar fashion to that?
I would say yes, and it's different in that, like a story, an analogy is an analogy, a metaphor is a metaphor, and then as we're talking about stories, they're a story. So what the benefit of using, because a metaphor, and now you're testing me because it's been a while since I've studied the difference between the analogy and the metaphor. But when
there isn't one. I use the words synonymously. An analogy or a metaphor, something is like something else.
Exactly. So when you're using a story to do this, oftentimes, most frequently, I would say the leader is using a story from their own lived experience. Or in some rare cases, they're telling a story that they heard someone else tell, and they're saying, I'll never forget the day my grandfather told me this story. And then they tell the story that their grandfather told. When the reason stories are so effective for leaders to tell is, again, it's giving that opportunity for you to share and express the nuances of who you are, to build deeper connections with the people that you're telling the story to or using the story for, to build deeper connections with you versus just to illustrate the point. Metaphors, analogies, great. Stories are going to be able to do more heavy lifting.
So do you feel it is more impactful to draw on stories that have a personal connection, or just stories? I remember, and I don't even remember the full detail, but to your point, I remember the story. But I think it was Julius Caesar, in one of his attacks, he had the soldiers burn the boats so that they couldn't retreat.
Right.
So telling a story like that, is that more impactful or as impactful as telling a story from my personal experience?
I mean, I think it can't. The impact is going. The impact is going to be different. And it kind of depends on. So if you're telling the story of whoever it was that burned the boats, if you're the leader that's telling that story, even though it isn't your own story, implicit, in order to maximize the power of that story, implicit in the telling should be your own enthusiasm and and excitement for what that really means, right? Like the burning the boats and why that story mattered to you and what it made you think about. Because just you've seen this happen, right? Where someone gets up, they're like, oh, I'm gonna tell a story, and then they share a quote, usually is what happens first, or they say so and so, Michael Jordan was cut from his junior high team. He was, da da da, and then he's now the most celebrated basketball player, and he has missed more baskets than he's ever taken. Like, that's fine, but why do you care about Michael Jordan? Any story that you tell is an opportunity, and this is so important, especially in our age of disconnect. Any story you tell is an opportunity, again, for the people that follow you, the people who you're leading, to get to know you better, to trust you, to understand you, to feel connected to you. So including other stories is certainly something you can do, but to get that element of why you as their leader are sharing this story and how they can get to know you better as a result, include some of why this story matters to you.
Okay. So let me just pick up on what you just said there. Cool. You were just saying that one of the points of telling the story was to get to know you better. So park that thought. Then we have but the point of the story is the message. So I've selected a story that sends my message, but it also get to know you better. It is the connector between that, the why I am telling you this story. In other words, here's the story, the message behind the story, but let me tell you why I've chosen it. I'm trying to help.
Yeah.
Because it's fascinating, this concept of the story helps me get to know the speaker better, which is great. How does that mesh with, but the story also has to send a message?
Yeah. This is you're getting into, this is like advanced stuff, Phil. And so I like it. So I would call this a story within a story. So to tell a story about, like a historical story, or, you could tell a folk tale if you wanted to. Like, there are some compelling stories that teach valuable lessons that have been told through generations in all different cultures. And you can tell that story just as it is, as if it illustrates the message, just as you said. Certainly. What I'm saying is, as a leader, build a layer like kind of around it. So say, I remember when I was 5 years old and my grandmother told me the story of the frog and the scorpion. I don't know why I keep talking about scorpions. Here we are today. Like, that's what we're talking about today, apparently. And then you can tell the story of that, but like adding that layer of why this story as a leader matters to you, why this illustrates that message, you're going to get more bang for your buck. You're going to be able to illustrate the message and give them a little bit of a taste of who you are.
Great. If we come back to your storyteller's triad for a moment, it's almost like you got to put you in the middle. Your personality has to shine through each of those 3 points. It's not just go tell a story to make a point. It's also to reveal who you are and how you feel about the issue.
Well, and I would say I do some, not a lot, very limited, because it's just the nature of the work that I do, but some executive storytelling coaching, let's call it. And some of the clients that I've worked with will be looking through stories, we'll be working with their stories, and we'll find a story that illustrates the message, that satisfies the audience, and it's a story. So it satisfies all those things. But to your point, that you in the middle, when they go to tell that story, when they go to work on that story, they're like, it's not doing it for me. Like, I'm not excited to tell that story. It doesn't mean that much to me. I don't know that it'll. And then, if you have an assistant who hands you a story, you're like, I need a story about overcoming challenges or never looking back. And your assistant comes and hands you a sheet that's, burn the boats. And you're like, okay, I guess that the audience is going to feel that. It should also be a story that you feel compelled to tell, and that'll be impacted in the delivery, as you said. Yep.
Very cool. Okay. Very cool. Okay. Fantastic. Let me shift gears for a second.
Yeah.
If you think I'm a leader and I have tools in my toolkit for the sake of an analogy, so I know how to coach a difficult employee, I know how to read body language, and is storytelling a tool?
Yep.
Or in your mind, is storytelling an essential in the sense that you almost always should include a story? So where's the line between the power of storytelling, but don't overplay it?
Yeah, I would say what happens or where a story starts is as a tool. Okay, so they're use a story in these different scenarios. If you have meetings, if you're sitting down and having a one-on-one with a challenging employee, you'll start to realize like, oh, I should use a story here to do this. I should use a story here to do this. What will end up happening is you'll start to see it as like your essential tool, right? So let's say you have all these different cleaning items under your sink. You have, this product, this product, this product, this product. But eventually, what do we all use? We all just grab the Windex because that's the thing that kind of solves everything, right? So that's what it usually starts. And this is what I've seen. It starts with someone saying, I'm going to work on this skill. I'm going to use it in these particular scenarios. They see how effective it is. And then they start branching out. What if I use it in this scenario? What if I use it in this scenario? And then they just end up, it's in emails, it's in phone calls, it's on stage, it's on the website. It becomes kind of an omnipresent approach.
Very neat. All right. Can I shift gears?
Of course.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned in one of your speeches, which I thought was actually really neat, profound, when you said the difference that storytelling gives you is it's the difference between getting the attention of the audience and the audience giving you their attention.
Yeah.
So elaborate on that a little bit, because in my mind, understanding that was a big motivator for telling stories beyond the fact that, well, it's a good tool to use.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've all heard it, the shrinking attention span of humans. And for a while, there was a very popular phrase going around that humans' attention span is shorter than that of a goldfish. And it's funny because we're saying, oh, well, it's the goldfish's fault. But the reality is maybe it's the person delivering the message. Like, we're not paying attention to things that aren't compelling. And so much of our communication now is not, it's boring. It's not compelling. So we don't pay attention. And this goes back to actually one of the studies that I referenced earlier. Remember, I mentioned Paul Zak, the neuroscientist, and he found that one of the chemicals that our brain releases when we hear stories is oxytocin. But the other chemical we release is cortisol. Now, we hear about cortisol a lot in terms of the health risks and benefits and in terms of stress, etc. However, the other aspect of cortisol is it is the chemical that forces us to pay attention. It's the thing that draws our attention in, that heightens our awareness. And when we hear a story, it triggers that release of cortisol where we hone in and we listen to the message more completely. So think about what that means then in terms of a shortened attention span. If you're using stories, that's where I said, like, you don't have to fight for someone's attention anymore. You don't have to beg for it. If you're telling a true story, an actual story, let's use that phrase instead, you are triggering a biological chemical response in the brain that makes them pay more attention. And we've all had that experience before, whether it's reading different articles on our phone, whether it's, maybe we're in the car, we're listening to the radio and we hear the beginning of a story, but then we have to turn it off and get out. How many times have you had that happen where you sit in your car longer? You've arrived at the destination, but you stay in the car because you want to hear the
Yeah.
rest of the story. And so that's what I mean. If you're constantly fighting for attention, use the thing that people give their attention to. Now, the question then becomes, well, you can't just, like, what if they don't know that it's a story? And so, where I would say the playing with the attention matters is, let's say you're writing copy for a digital ad. The first few sentences of what they see on that ad, whether they read it, whether they're hearing it, whether it's a video, need to have the promise of a story. It needs to signal that if you keep watching, if you click and read further, you're going to get a story. That's the trigger of cortisol, and they'll stay with you.
That's cool. That's neat.
Hack, right?
That's pretty cool. Would you say that it would make a difference depending on the level I'm at in an organization? If I'm an executive, a manager, a frontline supervisor in a warehouse, the way in which I approach stories or think about them?
Yeah. The more authority you have, the more grace you have in some ways. So let's say you're the CEO and everybody knows it. And you can get away with a little less. Let's say you're starting to tell a story and they don't know exactly where it's going. You probably get a little bit more leeway to make your point because of that relationship. Like they have to listen to you. You're their boss, right? That's kind of how it goes. So if you are lower in the chain, how you need to think about it differently is it needs to be very clear and early on why you're telling this story, right? That you know the point you want to make, you're respectful of their time, and this is the story that's going to make it happen. Your stories need to be tighter, they need to be sharper. As people start to trust, now this is a different aspect of trust, that you do know what you're doing, that when you open your mouth and you tell a story, people are going to want to listen because you're going to be making a compelling point. You don't get as much leeway. The further you are up in the organization, the more leeway you get with that.
More grace.
Yep.
As I was thinking about the time together here today, we are an experiential learning company, which means that we put people into what you would think of as a very fun, high-energy game, but you completely separate from reality. So you think you're going to a training course and you might end up crossing the desert or being in the United Nations. Everything is completely transformed. And then at the end of that experience, we do a debrief. So as I was thinking, it's almost like the reason the experiential learning is so powerful is we have put them into a story. They are actually living the story, which I'd never really thought about, but it highlights what you're saying, that it's one thing you listen to the story, you're more engaged, you actually participate in the story. And I remember Walt Disney once said that he wanted people, when they walked into his park, to feel like they were in the movie.
Yeah.
Like they're actually participating. And I think it explains one reason why the experiential learning is so powerful. You're actually living the story that has been crafted for you. Does it make sense?
Yep, absolutely. And you have those opportunities for emotional connection. I'm sure you have, there are specific moments throughout that journey where they're drawn in to it, details that they will remember later. It makes perfect sense.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So let me move off of leaders for a moment and talk about culture.
Yeah.
One of the things that is very important in today's world is organizations building the right culture. So talk about storytelling as a vehicle to help craft the right culture. The right meaning the culture we want, the kind of people behaving in the way that we would like them to behave without sort of getting day-to-day direction. Because storytelling would have a place there.
Well, and even outside of business, again, all the way back, the stories that are told, whether it's in a micro culture or a massive culture, it's the stories that connect people, that assimilate them, that let them know that this is how we do things. This is how this community behaves. I know that, I mean, I have kids in schools, and as we go to each different school, they go from elementary school, they go to middle school, they go on to high school. And in New York City, where I grew up, you started here and then you ended up at the high school that was closest to you. That's not the case in New York City. So there's a lot of moving around, and you're hearing a lot of stories. And that's what's being shared between parents, are the stories of what is happening in the cult that illustrate the culture of each of these different schools. So this is, I mean, any culture is built on the stories that are and are not told. So as you're looking to indoctrinate, build and then bring people in so that they quickly understand what that culture is, the faster they'll be able to understand and really feel it is through the stories that are told. So a few ways that this can be done is to make sure that, I mean, and there are touch points now with organizations long before a person ever actually walks through the doors of your building, right? So what are the stories that you can share on your website, on your social media platforms, that illustrate the values that matter to you? I'm sure anyone listening here has an organization. You probably have a website that says our values. And I'm pretty sure that on that tab, there's just a list of what the values are. But why not tell a story of that value in action in your organization, so that as people are thinking about encountering your organizational culture, whether as a customer, yes, but certainly as an employee, the stories are there. Then as they become a part of your organization, tell the stories of what it means to work here, how we operate together as they're going through their orientation. Have panels of current employees sharing those stories. And the more stories that are told that illustrate the values that you're trying to uphold, the better people will be at the better they'll understand what that really looks like and how to behave. Now, the other side of this, of course, is certainly we all have ideal cultures. We have values we want to uphold, and sometimes we don't always hit the mark. So this is where there's another opportunity when it comes to culture, and this falls back on the leaders, since we were just talking about leadership, is to keep an ear out for what are the stories that are being told that maybe are not in line with your cultural values, and don't hide from them, because those stories will be told whether you want them to be or not, right? So pretending they're not there or acting like they're not a big deal isn't going to help. The stories have a life of their own in that way. Instead, to figure out what those stories are, where they came from, and then you have an opportunity for discussion of, okay, what changes can we make so that these stories don't happen anymore, and we can continue building the stories that are true to the culture that we want to express.
So the idea of telling stories to illustrate values on the website is very powerful, because the story illustrates the value as opposed to just stating the value.
Everybody states the same values. Let's face it. I mean, you can add fancier words around it. Like, instead of saying excellent customer experience, you could say obsessed with customer happiness. I mean, we found all sorts of fancy ways to say the same thing over and over again. But what's really going to matter to someone, what they're going to feel, what they're going to take in and remember, are the stories you tell about what it means to really put your customer first. When's the time that happened? Tell that story.
So do you think stories need to appear spontaneous, or is it okay if the story is structured but still carries the weight and the personal component?
It is perfectly fine, and I would strongly encourage that you have some very intentional stories in your tool belt, in your arsenal. You should go and find various stories that illustrate each one of your company values. And you should put time and effort into writing those stories up and putting them on your website, sharing those stories in videos, whether it's internally or externally. If you're in sales, you should have a handful of specific stories that illustrate the value that your company, your product, your service, you as their representative bring to the table. Like, there should be some very intentional stories that are told over and over and over again. And yes, of course, there's moments for spontaneous stories, right? Like the story that I told you could be a spontaneous story that, whenever a question comes up, if you have an experience that you can remember that answers that question, tell that story.
Again, that's a fascinating point of view, because I agree with you. I'm just thinking that I think the average person would think, oh, a story is something I should just make up in the moment versus something I should think about as a powerful way to share what I actually feel and believe.
I think that there are people who have carried the storytelling gene into the modern world. And they are natural storytellers, even in high stakes strategic situations where they can just pull out a story and get the job done. Or maybe they've been working on their stories for a long time, but maybe they read all my books and they've been practicing this. What I think is important about what we just said there is that there are people who assume that story is a talent, that storytelling is a characteristic that some people have and some people don't. And who I'm most concerned about are the people who think, well, I'm just not good at that. Like, that's not naturally who I am. And it's really important that you understand that you're missing a whole aspect of compelling communication by writing this off as a talent that you just weren't born with. Instead, again, story is a skill. It's something that you can practice. It's something that you can work on. It's something you can prepare for. So if you are the CFO and you're all about numbers, you're super boring, you just assume you think you're super boring, right? You're always talking about the technical stuff. You assume that the stories and the flashy stuff is for the chief marketing officer instead. You're missing an opportunity. It might mean that, yes, as you're preparing for your address at the annual convention, that you need to take a little bit of time to think about that story triad that we talked about, but it is still available to you. And no, you don't have to spontaneously come up with a story. I would say even the best people who are great at telling stories by nature put some preparation into it to make sure, because they know just how important telling the right story to that specific audience really is.
Very cool. Let me ask you one last question here around the whole storytelling thing. A lot of the conversations that we have with leaders are, what advice do you have for dealing with the new generation of folks coming into the workplace?
Yeah.
So talk about storytelling as a natural way, I think, to deal with this current generation coming in who seem to have grown up around the whole world of storytelling, which is what a lot of what they think.
So I get asked a lot because it's a big topic. Like, how do I deal with these there's the leaders of yesterday look very different than the leaders of tomorrow. Like, even just a few days separate them, right? Again, story works no matter how old they are. I mean, that just hasn't changed. And even though technology has advanced and so many things have changed from when you were new in the workforce to when they were new in the workforce, keep in mind, we are all still born with an appendix that we don't really need. We are all still born, we still have wisdom teeth that can be taken out. Like, though technology has changed and the way we've grown up has changed, humans themselves have not changed that much. So that need for story is still there. And what I would say is, as you're working with various generations, or whether it's generational differences or cultural differences or belief differences, whatever it is, I believe that we have been trained right now more than ever, but always we have been, to be focusing on these differences and the way that we are so different. So when you're thinking about, and I'm not going to say, but we're really also much the same, which is true, but I want to get more specific about this. When you're thinking then about the stories that you're going to share, your job is to think about the ways that you are the same, the experiences that you've had that are similar. So again, let's say we're thinking about your audience. Let's say that that this audience that you're tasked with they all have financial backgrounds. They had to pass the CPA exam because you're the financial leader, okay? And you're talking to them. You can tell stories about how hard it is to, the grueling process of going through your entire financial education. There are stories that are similar there, no matter how different you are in your ages. And even the differences in those stories become entertaining. They become a point of connection instead of a point of divide. Or let's say that you're talking to the whole organization, so you don't have maybe role differentiators. That's when you can go all the way back to the various experiences that we've had. So maybe you tell a story about your first day of work, because here they're having their first day of work. Maybe you tell a story about, again, sports. Lots of people have played sports, and if they haven't played sports, the whole sports motif, the sports genre, they've seen one of the movies, right? So think about the things that you have in common, the experiences that, regardless of generations you've had, the people that have been in their lives, the wacky teachers, the whatever it is, and focus your stories there and focus on telling those stories instead of focusing on how different you are and trying to explain how different you are. I think it's better to show actually we're a lot alike, to at least start there.
Very cool. Kindra, you have been a fountain of wisdom. It's been great chatting with you, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think the topic is critical because communication in today's world becomes so important, and people need ways to communicate more effectively. Yep. So,
well, I appreciate you, Phil. Those are some great questions I haven't been asked before. So I appreciate all the thought that you put into it. I love this conversation.
No problem.
This has been Leading What Matters Most with Phil Geldart. If you want to create a culture that drives performance and develop leaders that inspire and motivate, go to philgeldart.com. Leading What Matters Most is a production of Forbes Books.